Good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking quite extensively about the presidency of Hank Hanegraaff of the Christian Research Institute. For many years there has been concern and some doubt whether he was truly handpicked by Walter Martin, the founder of the ministry. And tonight we're going to be looking at this issue more in depth than I think anybody else has really looked at before. We're going to be dealing primarily with the handpicked successor issue and how he actually became president of CRI. Also, we're going to be looking at several scandals that took place after his presidency began in 1989. Shortly after the death of Walter Martin on June 26, 1989, the Christian Research Institute published a ministry newsletter which served as a tribute to him. It was in this newsletter for the first time there was a public mention of a man named Hank Hanegraaff, and that he would be the new president of CRI. At that time, it was believed by most people outside of CRI, since virtually no one had heard of Hank Hanegraaff, that Martin had probably discovered him in some seminary and had been impressed with his theological brilliance and apologetic acumen. Up to this time in 1989, there was no mention of him in any of CRI's publications. He had never authored any articles, never mentioned in any newsletters, hosted the Bible Answer Man program, nor been involved in any public ministry for CRI. To the supporters of CRI, he was a complete unknown entity. For several years after this, it never occurred to me that he was anything else but the handpicked successor of Walter Martin that he incessantly claimed to be. In those first few years, he repeated the handpicked successor mantra to anyone who would listen. He repeated it on the radio, in public appearances, in CRI publications, and he said it so many times and for so long that everybody just assumed it was true. In 1999, in a chance meeting with Kevin Rishi, Walter Martin's son-in-law, I began talking with the Martin family about Hank Hanegraaff. They began to share with me some of their ongoing concerns with his veracity. They had come to the conclusion that Walter Martin had hired Hank Hanegraaff to simply help with fundraising at CRI, and that no one from the Martin family had ever heard him talk about Hanegraaff as the next president of CRI. I decided I had to investigate the presidential claims of Hank Hanegraaff myself. I decided to understand what was really true. I needed to understand what was really true, so I began to research and interview as many people as possible that were part of CRI in the 1980s and 1990s. It would also be necessary, I concluded, to interview people who currently worked for the ministry. I obtained the name of a former board member of Walter Martin who had served on the CRI's board for 19 years. I spoke with initially two researchers who worked with Martin in the 1980s and worked in the office on a daily basis. Their names are Craig Hawkins and Rich Pohl. They all recalled clearly the Monday morning when they heard of the death of Walter Martin. But they also told me that at no time did Martin ever talk to the staff about Hanegraaff ever becoming the new president of the ministry. To their knowledge, he was strictly involved in fundraising and increasing the visibility of CRI to the public. This was also a statement made by Stan Tonneson, the board member who had been with Walter Martin on the board for 19 years. He had never heard Walter Martin mention Hank Hanegraaff as a possible successor in any CRI board meetings or in personal conversations. In an interview I did with him in August of 2000, we had the following exchange. Did you ever hear Martin state that Hanegraaff was to be his successor? Stan Tonneson. No, he was looking for other individuals, but he never mentioned Hank Hanegraaff as his successor. I had contacted CRI via email in June of 2000 to ask what post-high school education Hanegraaff had and if they could furnish me with either a letter or audio tape of Martin expressing his desire that Hanegraaff become president upon his death. I received no reply. Almost a month later, on July 25th, I sent another email stating I was looking for a letter or a tape of Martin offering the presidency to Hanegraaff, and that my inquiry was in conjunction with a small article I was writing concerning Hanegraaff as president of CRI. Within 24 hours, I received an email response. Curiously, there was no information in the body of the email concerning Martin's public or private decision to make Hank Hanegraaff the next president of the ministry. I was invited to call a toll-free number and talk to John Stoffel, the ministry operations manager at CRI, who had sent me the email. In the ensuing conversation, he questioned my motives for calling him. He told me of the problems with the Walter Martin website He also told me that all the things that Jill Rishi and her husband Kevin had told me about Hanegraaff were all lies. The one thing he did not comment on was whether there was any proof of the so-called handpicked successor story. He then suggested that I speak with Elliot Miller, who had worked with Walter Martin for many years and who was still an employee of the ministry. I then repeated my question to Elliot Miller if he knew of any letter or audio tape by Walter Martin. He told me there was no such evidence of Martin's offer to Hanegraaff. I then asked him if he ever heard Martin mention to the staff that Hanegraaff was to be the next president. Miller informed me that he had heard him say at least on one or two occasions in the presence of other researchers. I asked him if any of the other ex-staff members could confirm this story. He said some probably could, but I should not be surprised if they said Martin never said it because, he went on, some of them may have an axe to grind with Hanegraaff and probably would not tell me the truth. Elliot Miller wanted me to believe that most of all the ex-staff members that have been interviewed by Bill Alnor and myself concerning this issue have lied to us for one reason or another. And though Miller is the only research person left from the old 1980s Martin staff, because the rest were either fired by Hanegraaff or quit because of the pressure they felt from him, we are supposed to take his word over multiple statements of ex-staffers who never heard Martin mention Hanegraaff as a possible president. The idea that he is the only one telling the truth defies the laws of probability. Since he is the only one still employed at CRI as senior editor of the Christian Research Journal, he has much to lose if he was to ever contradict Hank's story. During my research in the summer of 2000, I also interviewed Tony Collerile, a longtime friend of Walter Martin who knew him when he was still living in New Jersey before moving the ministry to Southern California in the 1970s. Mr. Collerile came out to California in October of 1988 for the dedication of the new headquarters building of CRI in Irvine, California. And I asked him these questions. You asked Martin in October of 1988 at the dedication how he was doing. Tony Collerile. He said he was training some young men like Craig Hawkins and Rich Paul, but he did not say anything about a successor. I met Hank Hanegraaff only once during this time. Hank Hanegraaff drove Walter and me to a Baptist church in Garden Grove where Walter was speaking at a cult conference. And my question was, did he say anything about Hank Hanegraaff during the drive? No, not a word, said Tony. This would indeed be a strange occurrence. Tony Collerile and Walter Martin had been friends for decades. October of 1988 was less than 9 months before Hank Hanegraaff would take over the presidency. Yet we are to believe that Walter Martin, who had been grooming Hanegraaff for the presidency for months, did not take this golden opportunity to tell his good friend Tony Collerile that they were being driven to the speaking engagement by the next president of CRI. Martin should have been proud of his new potential president and protege, yet he did not say anything to Mr. Collerile, though a few minutes before, he had been talking freely about the abilities of Craig Hawkins and Rich Paul. If it were true that Martin had mentioned Hanegraaff as the future president to many staffers, why would he not make his intentions clear to his longtime friend from New Jersey? We have found no one, whether they are family of Walter Martin, former CRI board members, ex-staff members, or close friends of Walter Martin, who ever heard him discuss Hank Hanegraaff as the future president of CRI. The only person who has come forward to the contrary is Elliot Miller, the only researcher who is still employed with the ministry from this original staff of Walter Martin, and a man who has proven himself completely and utterly loyal to Hank Hanegraaff. Since there is no empirical evidence that Hank Hanegraaff was ever asked by Walter Martin to take over the ministry, the question needs to be asked, is it possible that Walter Martin would promote a man like Hanegraaff? First, it can be adequately demonstrated Walter Martin had a vast love for the educational process. I began reading The Kingdom of the Cults, Martin's opus work in 1976. After finishing reading my copy, I became extremely interested in acquiring other writings by him and listening to his lectures via audio tape. Until his death in 1989, I read no less than 6 of his books, listened to dozens of hours of his tapes, and from September of 1978 to April of 1979, I lived in Anaheim, California, and attended his Sunday school class that he taught at Melodyland Church, the church that he was associated with in the 1970s. Throughout his writings and lectures, he made frequent reference to his educational experiences at schools like Stony Brook, New York University, and his days in seminary. He recounted experience after experience that had helped shape his life and his thinking. He told stories in great details of teachers and fellow students he had known throughout his life. He spoke with great affection of how his educational background had led him inexorably to the place where he could defend the Christian worldview against all comers with a combination of skills that heretofore had not been employed before to uplift the cross of Christ and defeat its legions of enemies in the guise of false religious systems. To say that Walter Martin had a love of education is a little like saying that Mona Lisa is just another painting. He surrounded himself at CRI with a research staff that was highly educated. By the early 1980s, the researchers you encountered in the office had bachelor's degrees, some were working towards master's degrees, and others on doctorates. In stark contrast, when you look at the biographical information on Hank Hanegraaff on the CRI website, there is not even the tiniest reference to any education or schools that he attended in his life. The only college background that the only college background that we know that he has is Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, from 1968 through 1972, but he never graduated. He had not even declared a major field of study. It is beyond the pale to believe that a man who has such reverence for higher education and surrounded himself with men and women who, with advanced degrees, would select a man who has so little higher education. The reason that there is no mention of Hanegraaff's educational background is fairly apparent. Were CRI to say that he has only less than 4 years of college, it would tend to cause people to wonder why a person who is trusted with such an important and scholastically intense ministry has so little academic training to run such an organization. To underscore this point of Hanegraaff's underqualified academic background and why Martin would not trust him to lead CRI, Kevin Ricci, the son-in-law of Walter Martin, told me about a conversation he had had with Martin in 1981. The year after Kevin married Jill Martin, they decided to move to Southern California. Coming to California with no job prospects, Kevin was anxious to land a job at his father-in-law's ministry. He asked if he could work as a researcher in the office. He was told by Martin that he had a strict policy to hire only people who had at least a bachelor's degree to work in the research department. At this time, Kevin had only 1 year of school. Kevin and Jill had met while they were students at Oral Roberts University in Oklahoma. I contacted Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the school that Hank Hanegraaff attended after he got out of school. In speaking with their records department, they were able to tell us about his transcripts. He attended from 1968 to 72, but never graduated. In fact, I was told that on his transcripts there was no mention of a major. I was told that the major is always listed on the transcript when a student declares the information. There was not even sufficient classes taken in any one area of study, I was told, to indicate if he had a major field of study in mind. His lack of drive to obtain even a 4-year degree seems to be the polar opposite of Walter Martin's thirst for higher education. The official story by Hank Hanegraaff is that he has been telling since 1989 is that Walter Martin had something to prove. The story goes that Martin had always had a theory that anyone, no matter how common, could be turned into an apologetic and cult researching machine by working and studying directly with him. Apparently, if we are to believe Hanegraaff, he was Martin's Eliza Doolittle in a kind of Christian version of My Fair Lady. The Christian world has been led to believe all these years that Walter Martin broke his own rule because he wanted to test his theory, that not only hired Hank Hanegraaff with virtually no college background, but advanced him to the very pinnacle of the ministry, that of president. There is a fatal flaw in the myth that Hanegraaff has been passing off as the truth all these years. That is the fact that when you read all of Walter Martin's material and you listen to his countless hours of lectures on audio tape, he never mentions once about his desire to implement this so-called theory that Hanegraaff has foisted on the Christian public. Martin did talk quite a bit about making information accessible to everyone. This, however, is not the same as taking an unskilled person and working to make him the president of the largest cult apologetics ministry in the world to show that he could train anyone. Walter Martin's love for education would not allow him to do this. It is clear that Hank Hanegraaff was never really conversant with the works of Martin, or he would never have advanced this ludicrous theory. Over the years, it has become clear that the leadership of CRI is actively trying to hide the fact that Hanegraaff does not have the academic qualification to be president. When people inquired about Hanegraaff's educational background, they received a standard reply. This is the automated response that CRI used to send out when this inquiry came in. Thank you for visiting CRI's website. If you wish to ask Hank specific questions or respond to your comments, you can submit your email with your mailing address through the following address. Thank you for your understanding and patience. May God bless you, CRI Operations. CRI has recently changed the information that they release about his education. Instead of making it into a personal inquiry issue between the person who sends in the request and Hanegraaff, they have altered their response. This is the new one. Greetings in the precious name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and thank you for contacting the Christian Research Institute. Although the volume of inquiries we receive has continued to increase, we do not currently have staff to consistently provide a timely and in-depth response to each inquiry. Hank Hanegraaff was disciplined under the ministry of Dr. D. James Kennedy and once served on the staff of Evangelism Explosion. Hank is for the most part a self-taught apologist, and much of his knowledge comes through personal study. When he was a non-believer in his late 20s, one of the resources that helped convince him of Christianity's validity is Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. We carry the new expanded version, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, for $29.99. Now, parenthetically, I find this a little unusual that right in the middle of a letter explaining Hank Hanegraaff's qualifications, they actually make a plea for somebody to buy this book, but that's what they do. How does Hank find time to study? Well, there is no easy-to-follow formulaic answer to your question. There are some practical considerations that may be taken into account. First of all, as host of the Bible Answer Man radio broadcast and president of CRI, it is literally Hank's business to study theology, cults, and so forth, and keep up to date on events affecting the Christian community. Therefore, during this time when others are on the clock in their secular vocations, Hank is typically hard at work conducting primary source research. Even this must be balanced. However, since the duties as president of CRI encompass much more than his research obligations. In addition, as you can probably imagine, Hank's passion for defending the truth of God's Word is also an integral part of his personal life as well. Therefore, you are as likely to find him reading and studying the Scripture outside of the work setting as you are to find him so doing within the walls of CRI. Apart from the above, the answer really just boils down to time management. When Hank is on the airplane bound for a speaking engagement, he studies. In mornings, before his children wake up to get ready for school, he studies. At night, after his kids have gone to bed, he studies. Rest assured, we are not employing hyperbole here. When you occupy the office of CRI, even spare moments need to be utilized for God's glory. Finally, and as Hank would say, perhaps most importantly, his wife shares Hank's commitment to truth and works tirelessly to assist him as needed, freeing him up for more pressing pursuits. This response was made possible by the sacrificial gifts of people who have been helped by the ministry of CRI. So it closes by asking for a financial contribution. But again, what they're pointing out here is that he just studies all the time. There's no real time when he doesn't study. The only thing, again, is missing is any mention of any educational background that would allow him to become the president of this ministry. The request for the educational background of the president of a ministry is not all that unusual. For CRI to take such a guarded position about Hanegraaff's is extremely strange. However, for CRI under this present leadership to hide information from the public is becoming all too common. To examine how other ministries dealt with the question of education of their leadership, I contacted several well-known ministries: Focus on the Family, Insight for Living, the Apologetics Resource Center, Spiritual Conference Project, Grace to You. They all talk openly and freely about the educational experiences of their president. Also, I found interesting that even though my ministry search was random, all the ministries I looked at had information about the education of their president. So in the light of this, it would seem extremely surprising that CRI would not discuss the education or lack thereof of Hank Hanegraaff. In fact, the biographical information available from CRI on Hank Hanegraaff is extremely sketchy, to say the best of it. When you read the information, it tells you that he is the president and chairman of the board of CRI, the host of the Bible Answer Man program. It tells very briefly why he is a Christian. It spends paragraphs promoting his books, some of his media appearances, and says that he and Kathy, his current wife, have 9 children. What is striking is that there is absolutely no mention or no information in his biographical statement that would hint at why he is qualified to be president of this ministry. It reads more like a promotional brochure for the writings of Hank Hanegraaff than it does a biographical piece. While it is true that many cult apologetics ministries started by individuals since the 1970s have founders and presidents that were all but self-taught in these fields, that it is imperative that all who work in this area of ministry must have a college degree is not the heart of the objection. It comes down to, would Walter Martin ask a man who does not even possess an undergraduate college degree to lead his organization? Where even a newly hired researcher must have a 4-year degree. It is overwhelmingly clear that this would not have been something that Martin would do. Hank Hanegraaff talked often in the early days of how Walter Martin had groomed him for the presidency. However, when you look at the Christian Research Journal as far back as 1987, there is not one article written by him or a mention of him. If he was being groomed by Walter Martin, why didn't he ever host the Bible Answer Man program? Martin oftentimes allowed other research staff to host the radio program. It would only be fitting that the man that would take over his office someday would fill in from time to time. The fact is that it was over a year after Martin died that he finally got behind the microphone of the Bible Answer Man program full time. It is abundantly clear that he used the first year to try to cram as much information about cults and apologetics into his mind as possible. Still to this day, he does not have a fraction of the information that Martin had acquired in a lifetime of preparation. There is also no record of him speaking on behalf of CRI at any cult conference before July of 1989. That Martin was anxious to groom young, talented minds, this is true. When you look at the CRI activity of researchers like Robert Bowman, Craig Hawkins, Ron Rhodes, Rich Paul, Paul Carden, and others, they were continually writing articles, and some of them hosted the radio program multiple times before and after the death of Walter Martin. For a man who was the handpicked successor, he did absolutely nothing in the area of cult and apologetic ministry for CRI before July of 1989. The Monday of June 28, 1989, 2 days after Martin had died, at the CRI headquarters in Irvine, California, according to staff members who were there at that morning, was an incredible mixture of stunned sadness and overwhelming confusion. Because contrary to Hanegraaff's assertions that Martin had planned for this eventuality, it was not true. Though he had struggled for many years with diabetes, his death was sudden, and after all, he was only 60 years old. He didn't have a full sense of how sick he was, and though it is true that he was always interested in training young men and women to become top apologetic researchers, his family and staff were never told of any one individual who was being groomed to take his place at the time of his death, including Hank Hanegraaff. According to Darlene Martin, Walter's widow, Hanegraaff assumed the role of media spokesman for CRI after the death of Martin. He helped draft the media press release, talked with the media who wanted information, and acted as a buffer between the ministry, Martin's family, and the outside world. Mrs. Martin told me how kind and thoughtful Hanegraaff was to her during those trying days. In the next couple of days, Hanegraaff began to see the opportunity that lay before him. He realized there was no clear presidential hopeful waiting in the wings, and he began his conspiracy to take over the ministry. The question is often asked, if Hanegraaff is not the legitimate president of CRI, how could the take over the ministry without raising concern? There are only two men who know how it happened, Hank Hanegraaff and Everett Jacobson, one of the remaining board members for Martin's board. It is obviously not in Hanegraaff's best interest to tell an Everett Jacobson, who was on the board of directors until his death in July 2007, never spoke to anyone outside of CRI, of what convinced him that Martin wanted Hanegraaff to assume the reins of the ministry. Jill Rishi, who remains the main spokesman for the Martin family and is Everett Jacobson's niece, has stated that even though 19 years had gone by, Jacobson had never explained to her in all that time about why he backed Hanegraaff in 1989. When we look back on the days immediately after June 26th, it is clear that there was a power vacuum, and the family and the staff were struggling with shock and profound grief. With this in mind, it is extremely easy to see how someone who was opportunistic could take full advantage of the situation. Since Stan Thompson, the other board member, was moved off the board in the spring of 1990, it is clear that he had nothing to do with the coup. Therefore, seeing that Everett Jacobson had never spoken to anyone outside of CRI about the matter, and he was one of only two left from the original board of directors, it becomes obvious that he was the one that Hanegraaff approached. It has been said that Hanegraaff is a very persuasive and charming person when he wants to be. It seems clear from things that the Martin family has said to me that the exchange between Hank Hanegraaff and Everett Jacobson was not a financial one. So it was through persuasion that Hanegraaff convinced Jacobson that he was to be the next president. Stan Thompson confirmed with me in a meeting I had with him in January of 2008, and when he asked Everett Jacobson how he knew Hanegraaff was Martin's choice, he replied, "God told me." It should be noticed that Jacobson never replied that Martin had told him about this information, but he never revealed to Mr. Thompson how exactly God had broken the news to him. The staff of researchers, secretaries, shipping, accounting, and receptionists were extremely motivated to work for CRI. Because of the uniqueness of the ministry in Southern California and because they believed in its mission, they were obviously willing to work with Walter Martin or whoever was at the helm of the ministry. They would not have had inside information about the working of the board and its choices. Therefore, it is logical that they would have no real reason to suspect Hanegraaff's new presidency in the beginning, since there was an seemingly full and exuberant backing by the CRI board consisting at the time of Everett Jacobson, Stan Thompson, and Hank Hanegraaff. There was a great deal of talk by Hanegraaff after Dr. Martin died that he had been groomed to take over the ministry. It is easily demonstrated that he was, in reality, only brought on to the board at CRI to help raise financing for the ministry. When the board minutes of CRI are examined, it is clear that he was only presenting financial-related information, and he was never called upon to be involved in theological aspects of the ministry, but reported almost exclusively on business issues. The following are excerpts from CRI board minutes. On February 23, 1987, Walter Martin introduces the idea of having Hank on the board of directors. This is a quote from the minutes now. Dr. Martin presented the name of Hank Hanegraaff as a possible board member, end quote. After he was brought on the board, he is referenced in the subsequent minutes as presenting financially related information. This is from the May 27, 1987 board minutes. Quote, Hank Hanegraaff stated we must maximize the potential of our current donor base and get volunteers to increase the turnaround time in responding to letters received at CRI. Hank will work with Leona to accomplish this task, end quote. July 3, 1987, another quote about Hank Hanegraaff in the board minutes. Hank Hanegraaff stated that we need to solve the problem of the deficit and managerial need immediately. Hank said that development is commitment to detail, end quote. July 29, 1988. Hank Hanegraaff addressed the capital campaign for the new building. He said that we have to establish a goal, allow for shrinkage, identify persons who will do the solicitation, and then identify those people capable of solicitation, and finally to identify people to be solicited, Hank will implement the program." End quote. On June 3rd, 1989, this is less than 1 month before Dr. Martin would die and Hanegraaff would become the handpicked successor, he was still talking business only. Quote, "Hank reported on the proposed CRI cruise and read a letter being sent to selected supporters. It would be a Caribbean cruise from October 28th to November 4th of this year. A motion by Stan was made to proceed with the cruise, and that Hank arranged to have letters sent out to all people on our mailing list. Hank presented a written report on Brazil and made comments on his trip to Brazil. Hank feels that CRI is definitely in the right place in Brazil. Hank commented on the many different problems at CRI that were critical and should be dealt with immediately. The board gave Hank complete authority to deal with and correct all the problems at CRI. Hank will give a report at the next board meeting on this matter. Note, the only other board members beside Dr. Martin were Everett Jacobson, a banker, and Stanley Thomason, a pharmaceutical researcher. These two men did not have the time to devote to these problems. This would have hardly signified that Martin had planned to turn over the ministry to Hank Hanegraaff, but only that he had time on his hands. Hank was given authority by the board to build the BAM program by adding or subtracting radio stations in order to make the BAM program profitable. Note, this again was only a business-related project. He was not being offered to appear on BAM and had never spent any time on the radio show. To put this into perspective, it would be analogous to a business manager at a hospital being offered a position as the head of thoracic medicine. It would never happen because he has no training in that field. In fact, in a resume kept on file for Hank Hanegraaff by CRI, it states, Heinrich H. Hanegraaff, our newest board member of the board at CRI, is president and founder of Memory Dynamics, Incorporated, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Mr. Hanegraaff has served in the past as faculty member of the Developmental Association for Christian Institutions. Note that he did not supply the Ministry of Serve International in Atlanta, Georgia, from which he was fired from in the early 1980s. He has been development consultant to Christian organizations in long-range planning, management, marketing, development strategy, and staff training. By providing training, technical assistance, and consulting services in current and capital giving programs, he has helped Christian organizations as Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Fellowship, and Youth with a Mission to significantly increase donation income. Again, this is strictly a business-related resume and never mentions any background in culture or apologetics. If Martin was mentoring Hank in the ministry aspects of CRI, the board minutes would have reflected at least some of this. It is clear that the only interest Martin had in Hank was as a fundraiser and a person who would help CRI find ways of cutting costs at the ministry. In those early years that Hanegraaff was involved on the board, there was actually a couple of men who were discussed as possible associate directors at CRI. The first was Ron Carlson, who currently has a ministry called the Christian Ministries International. The other was John Stewart. These two were talked about during various board meetings as working directly with Walter Martin. In board meeting minutes dated October 17, 1985, there is this mention. Ron Carlson is still interested in the position of Associate Director of CRI, but has not sold his house, and if he accepts the position, it will not be available until sometime in 1986. In the board minutes dated September 12, 1986, there is this mention of John Stewart as a possible assistant director. Stan then brought up John Stewart's proposal and reiterated the board's discussion earlier in the meeting to John. Walter stated his views on what he expected from an assistant director. End quote. There's nothing in any of the minutes from those years in which there was ever discussion about Hanegraaff as a possible associate director for CRI. This associate director's position appears to be the position that was offered when Martin had special interest in a man. It will be incumbent for CRI at this date to show actual documents that would show Martin's interest in Hanegraaff to be the next president. Hanegraaff has spoken over the years of conversations that he had with Walter Martin of his keen interest in Hanegraaff's abilities. Claiming private conversations with Martin about his alleged interest in Hanegraaff as a replacement for him is hardly offering rock-solid evidence. It is as if Walter Martin and Hank Hanegraaff had a meeting under the bridge in Pomona, California at 2 a.m. where Martin pledged that he would be the next president. Perhaps CRI will attempt to claim that since October 1988, Hanegraaff was given an executive position on the board. Martin meant that to indicate that he wanted him to take over the ministry. Logic would not be on its side. Most boards contain titles such as vice president, secretary, etc. This is not usually an indicator of an ability to assume leadership positions, leadership outside of the boardroom. In Hanegraaff's case, it was believed by Martin that he could oversee the financial issues of the ministry. If a person with a normal ego was put in this position, they would not conclude that they were all prepared to carry out any and all tasks that the well-trained head of the organization performed. After Walter Martin's death, Stan Thomason was made vice president of CRI. If Hanegraaff had died suddenly, would it then have been appropriate to appoint Mr. Thomason, who by trade was a pharmaceutical researcher, the new president of CRI? In almost all cases, the board position is a function within the board only. Many people have written to CRI over the years asking to see some type of written evidence for Hanegraaff's claim that Martin wanted him to take over when he died. Those requests have gone completely unanswered. We will now see the way in which a great ministry was usurped by a man who can rightfully be described as a megalomaniac. The question needs to be asked: if Hank Hanegraaff truly had the best interests of CRI at heart, why was he in such a hurry to be crowned president of CRI? A man who did not have the abilities to carry out in the capacity of president of CRI. No one on the board had any real theological training to be the president of this most vital ministry. Stan Thomason was a pharmaceutical researcher in New Jersey, and Everett Jacobson was a banker in Florida. If the intent was not to usurp a ministry that he had no rightful claim to, but only to be only the continued preservation of a great ministry, the correct thing to do would have been to put together a CRI search committee to find the most qualified person to become the new president. But that was not Hanegraaff's chief motivation. His motivation clearly was to find a way to control CRI to such an extent that would help him achieve a level of wealth that would allow him to acquire the things in life that he seems to believe would get him the respectability that he so craved. In a calculated attempt to steal the presidency, he convened a board meeting at 8:45 a.m. the morning of Walter Martin's funeral. The following was recorded by Everett Jacobson, the board secretary. A special board meeting of the Christian Research Institute was held on June 29, 1989 at 17 Hughes Street, Irvine, California, due to the homegoing and passing of the president of the Institute, Dr. Walter Martin, on June 26, 1989. Present were Stan Thomason, Everett Jacobson, and Hank Hanegraaff. The meeting was called to order at 8:45 a.m., the opening prayer and a meditation by Hank Hanegraaff. Everett made a motion that Hank be named president of Christian Research Institute with reaffirmation that Stan Thomason continue in the capacity of vice president, treasurer, and Everett Jacobson as secretary. A second was made by Stan Thomason, and the motion unanimously passed. Why 8:45 in the morning of Walter Martin's funeral? Clearly, the naming of his successor could have been put off until much later. It would have given CRI not only time to grieve, but to conduct a national search to find the most qualified person to lead the ministry forward. However, time was not Hank Hanegraaff's friend. He was a desperate man. He needed to move quickly to cement his position before anyone had time to think. He wanted that vote in the morning so he could, in the afternoon, tell John Ankerberg, the man who acted as the MC at the funeral, that he had been unanimously voted in as the new president. So that afternoon, as the hundreds in attendance at the funeral listened on, John Ankerberg made it official. The board of CRI had granted to Hank Hanegraaff the position of president. The only thing not known to those in attendance and the thousands of CRI supporters around the world was that the board was not made up of multiple people, but only three. One who had secretly been convinced by Hanegraaff and one who had never been approached. When people hear the phrase board of directors, it conjures up an image of a large group of people, perhaps a half a dozen or more. So when John Ankerberg said it was a unanimous vote, it sounded more dramatic than it really was, because all it took was simply Jacobson and Hanegraaff to vote for Hanegraaff. In reality, Stan Tonnyson's vote was extraneous. Hanegraaff would have still been president had Tonnyson voted against him. The sad truth is that had there been even one more person on the board, the presidency of Hank Hanegraaff probably would never have happened. On June 29th, of the memorial service for Dr. Walter Martin was held at Capistrano Valley Church. Darlene Martin spoke to the audience and in her closing remark appeared to announce for the first time that Walter Martin had picked Hank Hanegraaff to be his successor. The following is the text from that portion of her message. Walter and I talked often about who would take over for him at CRI if God were to take him home. Since last October, Walter Martin asked Hank Hanegraaff to work with him and to be that man. Little did we know that it would come this soon. But Hank is a man that Walter wanted to lead CRI, and I'm eternally grateful for this man, for the uplifting that he has done for me in these past few days. He is a godsend, and I'm grateful for him and his family. I know the Lord is going to bless CRI, that the ministry is going to flourish under Hank's direction. I thank the Lord for him and for CRI and for all the staff, from who are going to carry on even in the midst of Walter's absence. And I just praise the Lord for it. Thank you again. This would appear to be proof that Walter Martin had personally asked Hank Hanegraaff to take over the ministry. After all, it was the wife of the founder who made the announcement. However, the truth is that the page that she read last was given to her by Hank Hanegraaff a few minutes before she went to the podium. The message she read was written in someone else's handwriting at the bottom of her proposed notes. According to Darlene Martin, Hank Hanegraaff approached her before the funeral only a few minutes before they were all ushered into the sanctuary, as she, the rest of the Martin family, and the 3 remaining board members waited in a room. Hank Hanegraaff came up to her and asked her for her prepared message. He told her that he would bring it back in a couple of minutes. When he did, he told her to read what was on the bottom of her notes at the end of her presentation. I have had a handwriting analyst look at the printed message, and the report states that the printed message was definitely not Darlene Martin's handwriting. Also, on the audio tape of the memorial service, there's a distinct pause when Darlene Martin got to the portion that was handwritten. She falters and appears to be reading something that she is not familiar with. This was indeed the case. Darlene Martin explained during an interview that this indeed was a known text to her. She stated that her husband did not like to discuss ministry activities at home and definitely had not discussed possible replacements in the event of his death with her. What a better way to begin your presidency than to make it appear as if Darlene Martin knew of her husband's plan and approved. This form of arrogant sleight of hand is common with Hank Hanegraaff. It should be evident that this is not a case of handpicked successor gone bad. Hank Hanegraaff had planned this ministry coup. We know of no other example in the history of Christian ministries where this form of Machiavellian-style takeover has ever been accomplished. According to Stan Tonnison, within days of the death of Walter Martin, Hank Hanegraaff asked and received a president's salary of $60,000. It should be noted that in the early 1993 interview with Ron Rhodes for the Christian Research Institute, Hank Hanegraaff said this about his interest in acquiring wealth. As a new Christian, my life changed dramatically. Before becoming a Christian, my life was characterized by a pervading sense of inferiority. I never felt as though I measured up. The only way to make myself feel significant was to acquire wealth. It was as though I was saying, look at me, I'm worthwhile, I have a beautiful home and own a lot of nice things. In this case, his old sinful desire for money is still affecting him. His love of money has completely overshadowed his presidency. Whereas Walter Martin earned a modest livelihood from CRI, Hank Hanegraaff and his wife, Kathy, have a combined income from the ministry in excess of $335,000 as of 2005. This is easily the largest salary within the Christian counter-cult community. It is also in the upper 5% of all Christian ministry salaries. In Hanegraaff's first public message as head of CRI, he made this statement about his primary task. One of the greatest tributes to the leadership of Walter Martin is that he astutely prepared for his homegoing. He often expressed the fact that CRI would be more important in the decade of the 90s and beyond than when originally founded 30 years ago. Under the leadership of the Holy Spirit, Dr. Martin developed a plan so CRI could move forward with strength and vision. In the near future, it will be my privilege to unfold for you the exciting vision and plans he left behind for the ministry of CRI. Now the question is, has he really kept to the visions of Walter Martin that he mentioned in this presentation? In fact, during the memorial service, he talks quite a bit towards the end of the memorial service about the love that he has for the late Walter Martin and how he was going to fulfill the vision of Walter Martin as the new president. Now here's just a few things that have changed since Hank Hanegraaff has taken over. For instance, a few years ago, Walter Martin was mentioned in the CRI Journal in the masthead as the founder and publisher of the CRI Journal. His name has since been removed. He's no longer mentioned as the founder of the magazine. In a 2000 radio interview with a friend of mine, Tom Marsland, back in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Hank Hanegraaff was coming to Minneapolis to do a radiothon for the Bible Answerman program, and Tom asked him a simple question. He didn't realize what he was even asking, I don't think, but he asked Hank, he says, are you the original Bible Answerman? And Hank's reply was interesting. He said, many men have sat behind the microphone, but I'm the current Bible Answerman. Again, no mention of the founder of the Bible Answerman program and the Christian Research Institute, Walter Martin, completely edited him out of the statement. Also, if you go to the CRI history page on the CRI website, equip.org, there's only really 2 sentences about Martin's life as a founder of the ministry, and there's several statements, several paragraphs of information about Hank Hanegraaff, but only 2 actual lines of the life of Walter Martin as the founder. Now also, I think it'd be interesting for you in this day and age to try to go to the equip.org website and buy a copy of Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults book. It's not even possible to buy a copy of the founder's great work on his website, which I find kind of interesting. Also, when Martin had the ministry in Southern California, you could actually call up the ministry anytime and talk to a researcher about Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism, Satanism, whatever you wanted to talk about. You can no longer do that. It is impossible to get anybody on the phone to discuss a concern about any cult groups or issues that you want to talk about. Also, under Walter Martin, it was very common for many of the researchers to write really large, lengthy articles for the journal. And today, except for writings by Elliot Miller and Hank Hanegraaff in the journal, everything else is literally written by other people that have been hired to write articles for the journal. And so he's changed substantially multiple things. There's really no sense that he's kept with the vision of Walter Martin, but he's really transformed CRI into an organization of his own liking, of his own caricature.